All right, let's jump into a topic that I think we all encounter, but maybe don't always think too deeply about. Randomness.
Yeah.
So you know that thing where something happens and you're like, what are the chances of that? Like, what are the odds? So we're going to unpack that idea of randomness today.
And it's interesting. Randomness, it's not just about chaos,
Right.
which is sort of the everyday understanding of it. It actually has these deep roots in math and in science.
Oh, wow.
Even philosophy. We've got this excerpt from a document that kind of breaks down different facets of randomness.
Okay.
And it's a really interesting way to look at the world.
So we are going to kind of come away from this deep dive, understanding randomness better.
Yeah.
And maybe even with some like trivia,
Silly.
trivia knowledge.
Yeah, a little like knowledge nuggets.
Nuggets. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Let's start with just that sort of everyday, way that we encounter randomness.
Yeah,
Like
go
you
ahead.
think about flipping a coin or rolling a die.
Yeah.
Like those seem pretty random.
Totally. You can't predict what's going to happen next.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
So while each individual coin flip or dice roll, is unpredictable,
Right.
over many, many repetitions, patterns start to emerge.
Okay.
That's where probability distributions come in.
Wait, so you're telling me we can measure randomness? That doesn't sound very random.
It's a little bit counterintuitive, right? But think about it. If you roll a die 1,000 times,
Okay.
you'd kind of expect each number to come up.
Right. Roughly the same number of times.
Roughly the same number of times.
Yeah.
Right? That's because even these random events, they actually have these underlying probabilities.
Oh, interesting.
And those probabilities, when you kind of plot them out visually, often form a bell curve,
Okay.
which is called a normal distribution.
So even though, like, I can't predict a single roll over time, those rolls, they actually create a pattern that is predictable.
And that is really powerful because understanding those patterns, understanding these probability distributions, that's what helps us make sense of a lot of systems that seem very chaotic.
Right.
Like if you think about finance, they use probability distributions to assess risk.
Wow.
Or in medical research, they use them to analyze data from clinical trials.
So it's not just like some abstract concept out there.
Right.
It actually has like tangible
Yeah,
effect.
real world applications.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's just scratching the surface. So now let's look at how scientists view and utilize randomness
Right.
across different fields because it actually pops up in some really surprising places.
All right, hit me with it.
Let's start with something familiar like the air we breathe.
Okay.
Did you know that the movement of air molecules is actually governed by randomness?
Wait, so the air in this room right now
Yeah.
is moving randomly?
It is. The random motion of all those tiny little molecules
Wow.
is what explains things like thermodynamics
Okay.
and the laws that govern how gases behave.
That is wild to think about.
It is, right. And then it goes even further. So in quantum mechanics, things get even weirder.
Right, let's go weirder.
At the microscopic level, some phenomena might actually be inherently random.
Okay.
And it's kind of like a coin that's both heads and tails
At the same time.
at the same time until you actually look at it.
Okay, so even at the tiniest levels of the universe,
Yeah.
randomness is at play.
It seems so, like if you take atomic decay,
Okay.
we can't predict when a specific atom will decay.
Hmm.
Only the probability of it happening within a given time frame.
So it's not just that we don't have enough information, it's actually like the decay itself
Right.
is random.
That's what it seems like. And this inherent randomness isn't limited to just the quantum world.
Okay.
It also plays a huge role in biology.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So think about evolution.
Okay.
Random genetic mutations are what provide the raw material
Right.
that natural selection acts upon.
Hmm.
It's like this genetic roulette.
I like that.
Every generation, there are these tiny changes in the DNA. And sometimes those changes lead to advantageous traits that get passed down, and that shapes the diversity of life that we see.
So without that random element, evolution wouldn't even be possible.
Exactly. And then it goes even further. It plays a role in animal behavior, too.
Okay.
Like think about the unpredictable movements of insects in flight.
Okay.
But that seemingly random buzzing around is actually a survival tactic.
Oh.
It helps them evade predators.
Wow, so even a fly
Yeah.
buzzing around my head
Exactly.
has to do with randomness.
It all comes back to randomness.
I'm starting to see it everywhere.
It's pretty remarkable, right? How this one concept weaves itself into so many different aspects of our world.
Yeah, it is.
And this brings us to another question, which is, if randomness is so prevalent, how do scientists actually study it?
Right. How do you research something that's unpredictable
Yeah.
by nature?
Well, there are ways to both generate and measure randomness.
Okay.
And that's what makes it possible for us to use it in so many different fields.
So you can create randomness artificially.
Yeah, you can. True randomness we get from natural sources a lot of the time.
Right, like those atoms.
But we can also use algorithms, which are like sets of rules,
Okay.
to
Right.
generate these sequences of numbers that appear random,
Right.
even though they're technically not. We call that pseudo-randomness.
So it's like controlled chaos.
It is like controlled chaos.
But it still seems random.
Exactly. And those numbers, those pseudo-random numbers, are really useful for all sorts of things.
Right.
Like scientific simulations, computer games, all kinds of stuff.
But how do we know if it's good randomness?
Right. Well, that's where measuring randomness comes in.
Okay.
Scientists have developed these tests and measures to actually evaluate the quality of randomness in a sequence.
Wow.
So we can actually quantify how random something is, which is essential for making sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do.
So we can generate it from the environment, from initial conditions, and then artificially.
Yeah.
And then we can measure it. That's pretty amazing.
It really is.
Yeah.
But there's another side to randomness that
Right.
I think we need to talk about, which are the misconceptions.
Okay.
Because there are a lot of mistaken beliefs out there that can really lead people astray.
I'm ready to bust some myths.
Okay, sure. All right, so one of the classic ones is this idea that, in a random sequence, a particular number is due to come up.
Okay.
So like if you flip a coin 5 times and it lands on heads every time,
Right.
some people might think, oh, it's due to land on tails next.
Right. Like it's got to even out.
Yeah.
At some point.
Exactly. But if it's a fair coin,
Yeah.
those previous flips have no impact on what's going to happen next.
Right. So the coin doesn't have a memory
The coin has no memory.
of what's happened before.
Each flip is a fresh start.
Okay.
50-50 chance.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And this misconception pops up everywhere.
I bet.
From gambling to sports to just everyday decision making.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm.
It's easy to fall into that trap of thinking that the past outcomes are going to influence the future ones.
Absolutely.
Right.
Especially when we're dealing with something that feels as unpredictable as randomness.
Right.
But understanding that each event is independent, at least if it's a truly random process,
Right.
can help us make more rational decisions
Okay.
and avoid those misleading intuitions.
So we busted the myth of the due number.
Yeah.
What other misconceptions?
Okay, so another common one is this belief that a number can be cursed or blessed based on its past frequency.
Okay.
It's similar to that due number fallacy, but instead of what's supposed to happen next,
Right.
it's about what happened in the past.
So like if a certain number comes up a lot, some people might think, oh, it's lucky,
Exactly.
and others might think it's due for a downturn.
Exactly. But again, that only makes sense if we suspect that the process is biased
Right.
in some way, if it's a fair coin.
Yeah.
Those past flips tell us nothing about what's going to happen next.
So it's all about if the process is truly random or not.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's a crucial point to remember when we're trying to make sense of randomness in any context.
Okay.
So, past performance, whether it's a string of wins or losses,
Right.
it doesn't guarantee anything about what's going to happen in the future.
This has given me a whole new perspective on how to think about randomness.
Good.
It's more nuanced than I realized.
It really is. And there's one more layer I think we should touch on.
Okay.
Which is this idea of dynamic probabilities.
Dynamic probability.
Yeah.
What is that?
So it means that sometimes new information can actually change the odds.
Huh.
It's not that the past outcomes are influencing future ones.
Right.
It's that the new knowledge can shift the entire landscape of probabilities.
I'm going to need an example.
Okay. So imagine I tell you that someone has 2 children.
Okay.
And at least one of them is a girl.
Okay.
What's the probability that the other child is also a girl?
I mean, at first thought I'd be like 50-50.
That's what most people think,
Yeah.
but it's not quite right because the fact that we know one child is a girl
Right.
changes the possible outcomes.
Mhm.
It eliminates the possibility of them both being boys.
Oh, so it's like girl, boy, boy, girl, or girl, girl.
Exactly. And only one of those scenarios has 2 girls.
Right.
So the probability actually drops to 13.
Wow. So it's not that like the first girl magically makes the second child less likely to be a girl.
Right.
It's just that the information changes the whole, like
Yeah.
the playing field.
It's like we zoom in on a specific part of the probability space.
Oh, that's trippy.
Yeah, and that changes the odds.
Okay, so you got to be careful about making assumptions about randomness.
Right.
Because new information
Yeah.
can change things.
Absolutely. And it highlights how important it is to really think through probabilities
Yeah.
and not rely just on our intuition.
Right.
which can often lead us astray.
This has been great.
Yeah.
I mean, this deep dive has been awesome. It's a lot more complex than I think most people realize.
Yeah, it really is. And there's still so much we're learning about it.
Oh, I bet.
You know, we've seen how randomness is kind of woven into the fabric of how we understand the world. Yeah.
From the tiniest particles to the vastness of space.
It's amazing to think that something that seems so unpredictable can actually be studied and measured and harnessed for practical things.
It really is. And speaking of those applications,
Okay.
let's move on to how randomness actually affects our everyday lives
Oh, yeah.
in ways we might not even realize.
Okay, let's get into it.
So let's think about something that we all rely on and maybe even complain about sometimes.
Okay.
Weather forecasting.
Okay, so how does randomness play into trying to predict the weather?
Right. So those models and the data are super important.
Right.
But they have to contend with this crazy number of variables.
Okay.
And a lot of them behave randomly.
Okay.
So you have these tiny little changes in temperature, wind speed, humidity
Yeah.
that can have this cascading effect and lead to totally different outcomes.
It's like that butterfly effect.
Exactly.
Where like one little thing
Right.
can change everything. A butterfly flaps its wings in one part of the world and it causes a hurricane on the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a simplification, but you get the idea.
Right.
These tiny fluctuations can snowball into major events,
Okay.
which makes those long-term predictions
Right.
so challenging.
So even with all of our like fancy technology
Yeah.
and supercomputers and all this stuff, we still can't predict the weather.
Yeah, it's really humbling, right?
Yeah, it is kind of scary actually.
It is a little bit. But I think what's cool is that, you know, understanding the role of randomness doesn't mean we just give up.
Right.
It means that we can develop better forecasting models,
Right.
make more informed decisions, and adapt to the inherent uncertainty of life.
So it's not about like getting rid of randomness, it's just about figuring out how to
Exactly.
work with it.
Yeah, to live with it.
Okay.
To maybe even use it to our advantage.
Okay.
And this is true in so many areas of life.
Right.
From finance to music to artificial intelligence.
Okay, let's talk about finance.
Okay, so the stock market, you know, infamous for its unpredictable swings,
Yeah, totally.
prices fluctuating based on all these factors, a lot of them seem random.
Yeah, it feels very random when you're trying to like time the market and all that stuff.
Right, like trying to catch lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, exactly.
But understanding that influence of randomness can actually help us make better investment decisions.
Okay.
It teaches us to diversify, manage risk,
Right.
and focus on those long-term strategies instead of getting caught up in those day-to-day or short-term gains and losses.
So we can't control the fluctuations, but we can control how we react to them.
Exactly. And that's really powerful.
It is, yeah.
It's a shift in focus, you know, from trying to predict
Right.
to developing strategies that can kind of withstand the inevitable turbulence.
Right.
And I think this leads to a really interesting point about decision-making in general.
Okay. How does randomness play into our decisions?
Well, every decision we make involves some level of uncertainty.
Right.
We can gather information, we can weigh the pros and cons, but there's always that element of chance
Okay.
lurking in the background.
So you're saying that even really carefully planned decisions can be swayed by something random.
Totally. Think about it like a traffic jam, or an unexpected phone call, or just a random encounter with someone on the street.
Yeah.
Any of those things can kind of nudge us in a different direction.
So are you saying we should just like throw our hands up and let fate decide?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging that role of randomness and accepting that we can't control everything,
Okay.
and then focusing on what we can control, which is our actions and our reactions to whatever happens.
So it's about being prepared and adaptable at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's that balance between planning and adaptability.
Okay.
And I think that ties back into this idea of taming randomness that we were talking about.
Right.
We can't eliminate it,
Right.
but we can develop tools and strategies to kind of manage it, minimize its negative impacts, and even harness its power for creative problem solving.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. I like that.
Cool. So I actually think it's interesting how randomness can enhance creativity in areas you might not expect.
Okay, like what?
Like music.
Okay, how does that work?
So have you ever noticed how some songs just have this really captivating, unpredictable quality?
Yeah, like they throw in a chord change or something
Exactly.
that you're not expecting, and it's like, oh, whoa.
Right, and that's often the result of actually incorporating randomness into the composition.
Oh, wow.
So composers have been experimenting with these chance procedures for centuries,
Mm-hmm.
using things like dice rolls or even computer algorithms
Right.
to introduce those unexpected elements.
So even something as like structured as music
Yeah,
can benefit from randomness.
absolutely.
Okay.
And it's not just about making things sound interesting.
Right.
It can also evoke a sense of spontaneity and improvisation,
Oh,
even emotional depth.
that's really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
So it's not just chaos. It can actually like enhance creativity
Exactly.
and expression.
Yeah, and this applies to other art forms as well.
Okay.
Like, think about Jackson Pollock's drip paintings,
Okay.
or like chance-based poetry from the Dada movement.
Mm.
They all kind of embrace randomness
Right.
to break free from those traditional constraints and explore new possibilities.
It's like randomness isn't just this force that messes things up. It's actually a part of
Yeah,
what makes the world beautiful and interesting.
absolutely. And once you start looking for it, you realize that it's woven into so many different things.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that.
From the tiniest particles to the grandest cosmic events.
It's like this hidden language
I love that.
that's everywhere.
Yeah, and learning to understand that language can really enrich our lives.
I think so too.
In so many ways, it encourages us to embrace the unknown, to be more adaptable, and to find beauty in the unexpected.
This has been great.
Yeah.
This deep dive has totally changed how I think about randomness.
Good.
I'm glad it's way more complex and also beautiful than I think I initially realized.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And speaking of fascinating,
Okay.
I have one more example of how randomness plays out in a field that you might not expect.
Okay.
Artificial intelligence.
Oh, wow. Okay, I want to hear about this.
So one of the biggest challenges in machine learning
Mm-hmm.
is teaching computers to generalize
Okay.
from the data that they're given. So we want them to apply what they've learned to new situations.
Right, so not just like repeat what they've already seen.
Exactly. We
Okay.
want AI that can think for itself,
Right.
be creative,
Right.
adaptable, and come up with new solutions.
Yeah, we want it to be smart,
Yeah.
not just like a really good search engine.
Exactly. And it turns out that randomness plays a big role in that.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Okay, how?
So it might seem counterintuitive, but a lot of machine learning algorithms
Mm.
incorporate random elements into their training.
Oh, wow. So like how?
Like, they might randomly select subsets of data to train on,
Mm.
or add random noise to the data itself.
Wouldn't that just confuse it?
It's kind of like adding a little bit of fuzziness
Okay.
to help it see the bigger picture.
Okay.
So by introducing that randomness, it prevents the AI from getting too fixated on those specific details of the data.
Oh.
And that forces it to develop more robust models that can generalize better.
So it's like you're helping it to think outside the box
Exactly.
by giving it random.
A little bit of randomness
Yeah.
can make a big difference.
Okay, that's so cool.
Yeah, it helps them be more creative in their problem solving.
So randomness isn't just about unpredictability. It's also like a tool to make things smarter.
It's pretty remarkable, right?
Yeah.
And it reinforces this idea that it's not something to be feared or avoided,
Right.
but a force to be understood, embraced, and even harnessed
Yeah.
for good.
Wow.
It's a part of what makes the world so complex and fascinating.
I like that.
Yeah. And, maybe even consciousness itself.
Whoa. Okay, that's getting deep.
That is getting deep.
But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it is a different way to look at the world
It is.
through this lens of randomness.
Yeah, it makes you question things.
Yeah.
And it opens up all these possibilities.
So it's not just a topic. It's a way to see things.
I like that. Yeah.
I think that's a good way to put it.
So I think it's time to kind of shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about some of the ethical considerations
Yeah.
surrounding randomness.
Right.
Especially when it comes to algorithms and artificial intelligence.
Okay, yeah, because we've been talking about how powerful it is.
Right.
But with great power comes great responsibility or something.
Exactly. And when we're talking about AI and algorithms, the stakes can be really high.
Yeah.
These are systems that are making decisions that affect our lives,
Yeah.
from loan approvals to job recommendations to even criminal justice.
Wow.
So how do we make sure that these algorithms, which often use randomness in some way,
Right.
aren't perpetuating biases or leading to unfair outcomes?
Right. That's a really good question.
It is a big question and one that researchers and ethicists are kind of wrestling with right now.
Right.
I think one key aspect is transparency.
Okay.
So really understanding how these algorithms work,
Oh.
what data they're being trained on, and how that randomness is being used.
So it's not enough to know that it's using randomness. We have to know how.
Right. We have to understand the specifics of how it's implemented
Right.
and what the potential implications are.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Like if we have an algorithm that's using randomness to select candidates for a job interview,
Okay.
we need to make sure that it's not favoring certain groups of people over others.
Right. We don't want it to be like, oh, you got unlucky because the random number generator
Right. Exactly.
took someone else.
We don't want it to be based on something that could be biased.
Right.
And this is where it gets tricky because sometimes those biases are really subtle
Right.
and hard to detect. It requires a lot of analysis, a lot of testing,
Yeah.
and ongoing monitoring to make sure that these things are being used fairly
Right.
and responsibly.
So it's not just the algorithms themselves, it's the people who are
Yes.
programming them and designing them. And
Totally. It's about the humans behind these systems.
yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And we need teams of, developers and ethicists and social scientists all working together
Yeah.
to make sure that these systems are actually aligned with our values
Right.
and they're being used to benefit society.
Right, not just to select you.
Exactly.
Okay, wow, this is heavy stuff. This is a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it's pretty deep, right? It's
Yeah.
not just a force of nature. It's something that we're kind of actively shaping
Right.
and integrating into our technologies.
So we got to be careful.
We got to be really thoughtful about it.
Yeah, okay, so I think we've covered a lot today. Like, we went from the very basic understanding of randomness
Yeah.
to, like,
The really big implications.
yeah, to the big implications of it.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has been. So before we wrap up, is there anything that, like, our listeners should take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that randomness isn't this, enemy,
Okay.
It's not something to be feared or avoided. It's
Wow.
actually a fundamental part of what makes life interesting and unpredictable and full of possibilities.
I like that. Embrace the randomness.
Embrace the randomness.
Yeah.
And even though we can't control every outcome,
Right.
we can control how we respond to it.
I like that a lot. That's a really good way to look at it. Like, it's not about eliminating uncertainty. It's about learning to be okay with it and maybe even appreciate it.
Absolutely. Develop that resilience and that adaptability and that sense of curiosity.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for leading us through this deep dive.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
I learned a lot.
Good.
Glad. And listener, thank you for listening. And until next time, keep on diving deep.